Welcome to the Exploring Washington State podcast. Here's your host, Scott Cowan.
Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of the Exploring Washington State podcast. This is episode number 223. This episode is part 2 of my recent conversation with Gary Campbell, the owner of Crane City Records in Seattle. Before we get started with the episode, I'd just like to take a quick moment and ask you to subscribe to our newsletter. There's links in the show notes for that. And if you would be so kind as to leave us a review on whatever podcast listening platform you do, that helps us in discoverability. So let's get started with our part 2 of our conversation with Gary. And these are there's something about an album, the size, the weight, like you said, the shape, the physicality of it lends a realness that a CD doesn't. Because I guess, I don't know, I'm just speculating here. Could I go on Spotify and listen to this album? Is it on Spotify?
That particular album is not, although I think someone at some point made a Spotify playlist that, because the songs that were on that album were intended to be exclusive to that vinyl. When the album was released, almost all of them were. And then some of those songs appeared on subsequent albums that those artists put out. But that was a goal, was that it was a vinyl only exclusive project. But I want to say this idea of the tangible, the physicality, is that part of that project with Solar Power was that every artist who was on the project was paid in vinyl. So every artist who had a song and had contributed to that record got a large stack of records themselves to sell at shows, give away to their friends. That was part of, not only did I want to make sure that everyone got paid in some way for their time and their work, and some of those artists took their stack of vinyl and sold them at subsequent shows and used that to pay for recording time for their next album. Some artists took those records and put them in their storage locker and planned to hold them for 20 years, and
like vintage wine.
Like vintage wine, exactly. And some artists just gave all their copies away because they just wanted to get them out in the world. And that was part of it for me, was just I also wanted to get these albums out into the world. And I actually went on vacation to Tokyo not long after that album came out. And so I took 20 copies and threw them in my luggage and handed them out in Tokyo. I went to like a really hip hop record boutique that someone had told me was like the place in Tokyo to go. And I walked in, and I'm the old white guy, and I walked in and I was like, "Hi, I have this hip hop record." It was some very, very cool young Japanese hip hop fans who kind of just looked me up and down and said, "Sure, whatever, man." And I gave them, I was like, here's one copy of the album, please, like, check it out and let me know if you would like any more. And they looked me up and down like I was never going to hear from them again. And the next day they emailed me, I guess it was, and they said, "Yeah, we'll take everything else that you've got." And because the music stood for itself, because they actually sat down and listened to it and realized it wasn't me making my music that I was handing them. Like, this was something that was a legit compilation that had some legs in the Northwest, and they were excited about it. I also met a DJ on that trip, and he was going to be DJing at a big club in Harajuku in Tokyo. And so he was like, "Hey, I'll put you on the guest list, come by this club." And he played most of the album at this big club in Harajuku, and it was wild. So like there were these moments of, and that's the thing with vinyl, which is interesting, is the way that the music carries and connects in a completely different way. I put out an album with this artist, Do Normal. I mentioned her earlier as being one of the people who came up with the name Crane City. And she had released a record in 2017 called Third Daughter, which she self-released herself and posted on SoundCloud, which is a music streaming website. And so she had this album, and it was a local gem that any number of publications like The Stranger, KXP, the Seattle Times all declared this album one of the albums of the year 2017. That Du Normal's
Mhm.
Third Daughter was just a phenomenal project that everyone should listen to. And one of the things in that, The Strangers, a music writer, Sean Nelson at the time, wrote in his review of Third Daughter, when is somebody going to put this out on vinyl? Because this is an album that, like, we need to have. And it was like something in the write up was something like, "Hey, Sub Pop, what are you doing? Like, why haven't you put this out yet?" And I remember thinking at the time when that record was getting so much accolades and so much praise, and I had just done this compilation where Du Normal had a song on that compilation, that her and I just started talking and saying, okay, well, the Stranger thinks it should be on vinyl. Like, we just did a vinyl. We kind of know the process. Like, what if we did this record and put it out again on vinyl? And that was something where, going back to your point about this difference between the streaming experience and the vinyl experience, is that I really work closely and collaborate with the artist to say, okay, if we're now going to take something that had a postage stamp sized cover on a streaming service and had a track listing, what can we do with the vinyl experience to create something that's special? It's going to have liner notes on the back cover. It's going to be
Yep.
12 inches square. In the case
Yep.
of the Du Normal record, like one of the records is clear and one of the records is black, and because it's a double album, and the center circles all have like different designs that when the record spins, there's like one is a little toy bunny rabbit that sort of is chasing around the center spindle on that side of the record. So we started thinking about this format of the album, of like, what are all the kind of cool little things we can do to make this something that's special, that when someone buys this, it will be a thing. All of those albums are numbered, so we made 750 of those, and they're all individually numbered copies. And
So it's become art.
and that's that.
It's
Exactly.
the album, the physical cardboard album cover, the everything there. You have now created, not that the music isn't art, I
Mhm.
don't mean like that, but you've now created tangible art.
Absolutely.
And if somebody was into this
Mhm.
and they bought copy number 5,
Mhm.
number 5, they might not ever open it, which is sad because the music might not get listened to, but you have the streaming services so you can stream the album. It'd be like, I think, like people that collect, like, I don't want to say real art, but like, I can't imagine somebody who buys, say, a Picasso
Mhm.
and keeps it locked up in a vault.
Yeah.
Like, I own a Picasso, but you don't enjoy it. So the album you might not enjoy, but at least you can, I don't know. I don't know if I'm making any
But
sense.
I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm not sure how much of the audience are people who are keeping these records in shrink wrap. I mean, I think,
Well, and I might be,
and I
yeah.
think that's something that is a little bit of an unknown. I certainly know a lot of I hate to say young people, but people in their 20s who are really interested in vinyl and physical media, and may not be looking at it as a primary place for music. But here's an example. There was an online uh, web series called Bazooka that came out during the pandemic, and this
Okay.
is a sci-fi dystopian future. It's set in Seattle, and it's a web series that
Okay.
someone made. I think it's probably got 7 or 8 episodes, and it came out some point in the last couple of years. It's called Bazooka, and I think it has some extra Z's or some extra A's. I'm not sure, but you do a web search, you'll find it. Bazooka
Okay.
Seattle. But at one point in this kind of sci-fi dystopian future, 2 of the characters are hanging out in an apartment, having a conversation about whatever the evil conspiracy that's going on in Seattle with the future. And they are listening to this Du Normal Third Daughter vinyl, and they're talking about it. One of the characters is holding the record cover, and like they're putting the record on, and they're having a conversation about this album. And it's funny because when I saw that in the episode, it was like, hey, I was, you know, I was sort of
I know
involved with
that.
making that thing that's the prop
Yeah.
in this TV show, but that
Uh,
is you know, as I said, it's changed the engagement or the relationship that someone might have, and it's in the background of this shot now for this web series. And people, you know, look at this cover and go, "Oh, what's that? What's that thing in the shot? Like, I want to know what that is." So it does change this relationship, I think, that people have with music and art, because you know, something like a vinyl record takes up space in your home. You have to store it, and you know, but we do things like that are really unique. One of the things that is specific to a Crane City music release. So I've now done. We just finished our 13th album. So
okay.
I've put out 12 albums are done and out in the world. There's a 13th one that is currently in production. Um, One of the things that was important to me, that almost every record I've released has 500 words of liner notes on the back cover.
Okay.
Not unlike what you might find on an old classical record or an old jazz record, where if you look at the back cover, it's an essay from a journalist about, you know, this record by Beethoven and why it's important and what he was
Hmm.
doing in that part of his life. I have worked with a number of people who are predominantly journalists and DJs in the Northwest to write these liner notes. So that might be Larry Mizell Jr. from KXP, or Eva Walker, or Jasmine from The Stranger, Martin Douglas, Casey Carter. These are all people who are writing about hip hop in the
Okay.
Northwest, or who are, you know, celebrating hip hop from, as I said, a journalistic standpoint. And so these are all people I look to help provide an input to me over what is hip and happening in the Northwest right now in hip hop. And then I ask those journalists who are championing these records to go and write me some liner notes about why this is such a great album and why everyone should listen to it. So every album that I've released has those liner notes on the back cover, and that's
So
kind of a
you, it,
signature of the Crane City release.
so at this time, at the time of this
Hmm.
recording, 12 albums have been released with one on the way.
One is on the way.
Okay. Right.
Correct.
Are these all limited fixed runs? In other words, you decided to press 750, or or would you allow, let's say, Do Normal's album, you know, you said 750, but if Do Normal came back to you and said, I'd like to do another run, would that be an option? Or are
Well,
you focusing on limited runs?
right now, everything has been a limited run. Everything's been a first run. Um, some
Mm-hmm.
of the records, I think there's 3 of them now of those 12 that are sold out completely. So I don't have any copies left. A number of them I have, you know, 5 to 10 copies left. So these were intended at the time to be something that was a one-time run with the artist. So I can't stress this enough, how very directly collaborative this process is with the artist. So
Mm-hmm.
what happens typically is that someone who is a musician in Seattle. So I'll give an example here of the 13th album that is currently in the works.
Okay.
So the 13th album that we just did a big pre-order campaign for. So the cat's out of the bag. Everyone knows what the album is.
Okay.
It's called Avada Kedavra, and it is by an artist named AJ Suede. And
Okay.
AJ Suede is a rapper and beat maker who is originally from Harlem, New York. He moved to Seattle 5 or 6 years ago and has become a big, important fixture in the Northwest hip hop scene. He's someone that KXP, every time he puts out anything, they make a point of writing something about his latest release. You know, Spin Magazine wrote a big piece on him recently. NPR just wrote something about him. So he's an
Okay.
artist that is getting quite a lot of national recognition, even though he's an artist from here in the Northwest, working in Seattle. But but AJ Suede did this really interesting project last year where he put out this album, Avada Kedavra, which was a 10-song album that he made, where he made all the beats himself and he did all of the rapping on top of this album himself. But Avada Kedavra is a spell in Harry Potter, which is
Okay.
the death spell, or the let this thing be destroyed is what it means. And um, it he wanted to name the album this because what he did was he took these 10 songs that he made, and then he reached out to about a dozen producers and remixers and people in the hip hop underground from around the world, and gave each of them one song with this instruction of Avada Kedavra, to let this thing be destroyed, and asked them to take this song and tear it apart. Take the verse and put it on a different beat. Take the beat and put different rappers on top of it.
Hmm.
Break the song into pieces and turn it into something else. And so
Okay.
this album that we're releasing is Avada Kedavra Deluxe, and it's a double vinyl album. And the first of the two LPs is the original 10 song project. And the second EP, or the second LP, is these 12 remixes of the original 10 songs. Um,
Oh, that's
so,
cool. I like
so this
that.
is something where, again, and so AJ Suede, when he released this project at the end of 2021, it got a certain amount of praise and excitement online. People were really excited about what he was doing and the kind of nature of this, both uh, celebrated work by him as an individual, but then also him bringing in this kind of like large collective of beat makers. One of the remixing people is from New York. One of those people is from Tokyo. One of them is from Ohio. So he was really trying to bring in people from all over different parts of the hip hop world and have them kind of work on these songs and remix them. And some of those the people remixers were also from the Northwest. There's a collaborator he worked with, Wolf Tone, someone who goes by the name Finds Double, and Christ Koopa. And so these were all people in the Northwest who were also involved in this project. And again, this is one where when we were putting this together, all AJ Suede had done was he had made a sort of postage stamp size cover art for this piece. And it was like, okay, how do we know we're going to put a 12-inch square cover on this? And we're going to have a front, we're going to have a back. He really wanted to, as a nod to sort of some of his own interests in Japanese art and some of the success that I've had selling albums overseas, we're doing this what's called a Japanese obi strip around the record. So it's a paper sleeve that goes around the front. You sometimes see it on a Japanese import record where it's all
Mm-hmm.
the information in Japanese. So this album has one of those, and apparently they're really cool in
Okay.
hip hop right now. So
All right.
so this album is something where we also, with this album, we did a different approach, which is that we in the past, with all of these limited run albums, in many ways, the Do Normal I mentioned, we did 750 of them. The original compilation, we did 1,000. A lot of that for me is just taking a guess at what I think the demand for the album would be. And sometimes I guess correctly, and we sell about that many copies. Sometimes I underestimate how many copies, and we sell out quickly. And there's some albums where we've got a whole bunch of them left over. But that's just the nature of having this act of guessing. And the pandemic
Yeah.
has also run into some of those challenges for us, just in terms of our sales pipeline. But the point of this is that with this Avada Kedavra project, we actually used a completely different model where we did upfront crowdsourcing for this album. And part of that was to help understand what the interest level was from the community. So we listed the album, we created we did a profile page, and then we just asked the community to back the project. And based on
Mm-hmm.
how many orders we received, that's how many we're going to press up.
How did that model work? Was the public receptive to that, to the idea of crowdsourcing?
I would say somewhat. I think it's a new model for me. It's a new model for a lot of people. I think it's as we move into the future and we start to think about things like our climate footprint. And I'm making physical goods. I'm making something that is going to be
Mm-hmm.
made in a factory somewhere, is going to be shipped
Right.
somewhere, and is I want to think about how I'm using resources and how those resources can be used effectively. So that's part of
Mm-hmm.
it from my standpoint, is wanting to think more about that. I think it's a challenge for someone who is going to back a vinyl project, that you lose out on that um, visceral immediacy of walking into a record store and seeing an album in a bin and going, "Oh, I got to have this," um,
Right.
because
Right.
you have the benefit of thinking about it and whether or not you want to get it, and recognizing that you, in a crowdsource model, are paying for it now, and then you're going to get that album in 6 months. So there's a different engagement with the medium that I think is something I'm still working through. But as a model, I think it's an interesting way to continue to make vinyl records and to better understand the size of the audience for some of this music.
So the artists that you work with, are these all independent artists not signed to a label?
Almost everyone that I've worked with has been an independent artist, not signed to a label. Yes. Um,
And I'm gonna guess that if somebody was signed to a label, and that the label would probably take over to do the album, not you. But if let's say that's not true, are the labels easy? Not yeah. Are they easy to work with? Are they trying to put their finger into the pie and make it their way?
Well, I mean, I think it's just the nature of, the way Crane City Music works is, I wanted to create a record label that wasn't based around ownership. I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of record labels, and the lion's share of how record labels work, is that the label buys the music outright from the artist. And
Mm-hmm.
and that's how most labels work. If you're Sub Pop and you want to work with an artist, you sign a deal with Nirvana, and you are buying the master tapes from Nirvana, and then now you now own the rights as the label to reissue this album and do a 30th anniversary edition and put it out on cassette and put it out on CD and put it out on hologram USB sticks or whatever the next format is. That's not how I wanted to work this label. For me, I always think that the artist should own their own music. And so the artists that I work with, I don't buy any rights to the music. I essentially license the music to make a single pressing vinyl edition of that music. So the way the record deal reflects that. So somebody like Do Normal or Gifted Gab or De Queen or Stas the Boss, I'm just looking at albums I've put out recently, AJ Suede, I would work out a relationship with that artist to say, I would like to do a one-time 500 copy pressing of your album, and then we work out how much we think that is going to cost to do, which might be somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000. It's not cheap to make
Okay.
a vinyl album. And
Right.
then we work out how much we think we could sell that for, and then we work out, therefore, how much money does that leave available for anyone to make anything off this project. And so it's often a negotiation with the artist on as an individual project to determine how this would work for this one project that has a very finite set of constraints.
Okay.
But that artist,
The other part,
sorry to say, that artist can
Go ahead.
then take that music that they have done a vinyl release with me. If they wanted to do a vinyl release with someone else, they could. If they wanted to put that music out on another label, they could. If the artist wanted to sign rights to put some of these songs into a TV show, that's entirely at their discretion. So the sync rights or whatever. So I'm not involved in any of the streaming or the sync rights or anything like that. I really just want to help artists create tangible pieces of artwork that they can sell to fans as merch or as a product that they can, play on a turntable or whatever that is.
I really like that.
Yeah.
I really like that concept. So you're licensing. So let's say I'm a musician. You're licensing my 8 tracks. We're going to do, we decide based on my fan base that we're going to print 5 copies and hope we can sell one of them. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to sell 1,000. We're going to, because I'm a relatively large
Sure.
I have a relatively large audience. We sit down. You have your criteria that you want to see because you want to guess right as close as we can. So let's just say we get to 1,000, and the artwork, though, the album itself, you're not pressing albums. That's being contracted out to a record pressing company, but you're coming up with the idea of, let's make this one orange, or let's make it clear, or let's make it pink, whatever. We're working on that collaboratively. So are we collaborating on, is this like my contribution to it as the musician, I'm bringing the music. You're bringing the marketing and art design to package my music. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, and I would say also that the artists are often, it's interesting. Someone who's a musician and works in the arts field often has a good artistic, like visual artistic sense as well. It's not, I think what we mentioned Macklemore a bunch of times. I have his record, The Heist, that came out in 2012 that has Thrift Shop on it. He released that on vinyl, and it's like a box set with like alligator skin cover, and it has these pieces of art that you can frame and put up on your wall, and they were all made by Macklemore himself. And I would say a lot of the artists that I work with are, really think about their work visually. So Gifted Gab is an artist I've worked with a number of times. Gifted Gab painted a painting for her cover artwork for that album, and so that was what became the cover art for that album. But yeah, I mean, I'm often working with those artists collaboratively because not only do I have a background in doing art and design, and I've done a lot of it, but also as the, I guess, business interests in the label, I also am able to look at what is possible, because there's some things that we want to do and they're just prohibitively expensive, because there's just not a way to do it effectively or easily. But then there's other things that can be done surprisingly cheaply. And so we're able to do that. I did a record with this artist, Perry Porter. So Perry Porter is he's actually another artist who contributed to the Black Lives Matter mural in Capitol Hill in Seattle. And Perry Porter does watercolor paintings and murals, and is a very talented visual artist. And he also makes hip hop music, and he's really influenced by Bob Ross, the painter from PBS. And so his album is called Bobby Ross, and it is his kind of version. So the music and also the visual design of that album is all modeled around Bob Ross and his PBS TV show. And the music that's on the album is really has all these audio clips from notable Black artists like Kara Walker or Jean-Michel Basquiat, or other visual artists from the Black community have sort of these little audio clips that span throughout his album between the songs as like little skits about the history of kind of the Black canon of visual art. And so that's a piece where, and in that case, Perry had this idea that he really wanted the vinyl to feel like one of his watercolor paintings. And so I worked with the pressing plant who pressed that record, and the vinyl itself is white, and then it has this spattering of color that
I'm looking at it on your
like
website
sprays
right now.
out from the center, and
Yeah.
it looks as if it's his palette, his paint palette. And so that was something that idea came from Perry, but then the logistics of how we were going to do it came from me working with the pressing plant to figure that out and figure out how we could do that cost effectively and how we could make that something that was viable.
So let's can we explore the technical
Sure.
aspects of that? How did you? Because my initial reaction when I looked at this is like I'm thinking about something like when I was in grade
Mhm.
school and went to a carnival and they had like this. You put paint on something and you spun it around.
Yeah.
And it kind of did this. Okay, and that's what this album evokes that memory in me. So back then, I'm going back to grade school. That's 50 plus years
Sure.
ago. So that's kind of cool that you can evoke this memory. Very cool. But how did how did they do that?
Oh, so a record is the vinyl pressing is a really interesting uh, medium. So the thing about records is that everybody knows the Beatles, obviously, but we got
Yeah.
really good at making records and making vinyl records in the 60s and 70s. Like in
Mm-hmm.
many ways, the technology sort of reached its peak in the late
Okay.
60s and early 70s. And vinyl hasn't really changed since then as a technology. And a lot of the pressing plants that you would work with are still pressing records on gear that dates back 50 years. This is 50-year-old equipment. And it's been a big challenge during the pandemic because a lot of pressing plants will run into supply chain issues where, one of their presses breaks down and that bolt that they need that goes in that part is a proprietary piece of machinery that hasn't been made for 50 years. And so they need to
Okay.
find someone who can manufacture that piece in order to bring the pressing plant back online. And so you ran into some of those kinds of challenges because you're just dealing with people who are making records using quite old equipment. Um, but that
Mm-hmm.
said, the actual manufacturing process for a record is you have these small pieces of plastic. It's a PVC. It's the same stuff they make drain pipes out of. The black drain pipes that are
Mm-hmm.
in your home. That's the same material of PVC that they make records out of. And any album is they start with these little chips. They look almost like little Lego blocks, and the vast
Mm-hmm.
majority of records are black, but because
Mm-hmm.
that's the color that PVC is naturally. But you can have these pieces of little pieces of plastic colored in any number of colors, and they're, as I said, like little Lego blocks is what they look like. And if you're making a record that's red, then obviously you need a bunch of red Lego blocks. And if you are printing a record that's orange, then you need a bunch of orange Lego blocks. Or sometimes if you're making, I did a record called Blue by Dave B. And ironically, the record is actually pink. But the vinyl record for this album is this beautiful like pinky orange color, and we actually worked with the pressing plant to land on a very specific shade of color. And the way we did that was it
Mm-hmm.
was a very specific mix of red and yellow and white blocks. So what they do is they take these little Lego blocks and they melt them down into almost a molasses consistency, kind of a honey consistency plastic. And
Right.
and then a record is made from a mold. So okay, let me start the whole process again from scratch, and I'll make it really simple. You take music and you carve music into a record. And that one copy that you make is the master. So the term mastering really refers to just making this one record, which is the master copy. You then
Okay.
send that master copy to a place in California called RTI, and RTI then makes a metal mold from that master copy. So, so you're
Okay.
creating what is essentially the negative of the album, and you have an A side piece and a B side piece, and these they almost look like tinfoil. They're very thin, and they
Oh,
form
okay.
the A and B side, and then you the way an album is made is that this A side and B side are mounted on a huge press, and then you pour in this molasses type material, and then you press it between the two A side and the B side, and you create the
Mm-hmm.
album as a result of that. So it's essentially like a mold process. Um, And yeah, so you melt this plastic down and you pour it in the middle, and then the A and the B come down and smush it into a record. And then it's the outside edge is trimmed to make it round, and they cut a hole in the middle of it, and you're ready to go. Um, and in the case of the Perry Porter record, the what they did was the puck of the album was white. So they were sort of this when they were first pouring that molasses in, it was just white molasses. And then the engineer
Right.
at the last moment, who was pressing the records, would throw on kind of a spattering of different colored Lego blocks that would then get smashed down with the record at the same time.
So so for that specific album, each album is going to be unique.
Correct.
See, that's where it's really, 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 really art.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is a unique. Each album's got the same songs, track 1 through 10, let's say. Side A's got these, side B's got these, but each platter, each disc is different.
And one of the things I've actually done, I did a 7-inch album with this woman, Sassy Black. The album is called Wakanda Funk Lounge, and
Okay.
Wakanda Funk Lounge was a short EP that Sassy Black made after she saw the Black Panther movie. And Wakanda
Okay.
Funk Lounge is based on this idea that in a lot of sci-fi TV and movies, you often have some kind of lounge where music is being played. So in Star Wars, you have the cantina, and there's a cantina band
Right.
in the background. In any number of episodes of Star Trek, especially in Star Trek: The Next Generation, there always seemed to have moments when Data was going to go off and play violin, and the whole crew is suddenly part of this orchestra that are hanging out on the spacecraft. And Sassy Black felt like she wanted to make an album of music that would be played at the cantinas in Wakanda in the background of the Black Panther movie. That one of her criticisms of the Black Panther movie was that there wasn't a cantina scene. And so she made music for the theoretical cantina that would be in Wakanda. The point of the story that I'm bringing up is that one of the ideas we had with that 7-inch was that this particular pressing plant that I worked with to make that album, they had a sale on where they were trying to use up all of the colors that they hadn't been moving very quickly for them. So they bought a whole bunch of lime green vinyl, and they'd bought a whole bunch of bright orange vinyl, and no one was buying. And so they just had large stacks of, as I said, what I keep referring to as Lego blocks, but they had large stacks of like leftover plastic. So they had a deal on where if I opted to settle for random color, then they would use up whatever colors they had, and they would give me a great price break. So this Sassy Black 7-inch, every one of them, we pressed 500 of them. We sold them out completely. But every single one of them was a different color. You'd pull it out of the sleeve, and one would be bright blue, and one would be orange, and one would be green, and one would be whatever the color was. And so that was, again, an opportunity to kind of do something special and different, where everyone was a different kind of special color. I did that twice, actually. I did a split 7-inch. Sorry, I did a split vinyl where there's two women who are beat makers and musicians here in Seattle. One is a woman named Chong the Nomad, and Chong the Nomad makes this amazing sample-based music. I want to talk about her in a second, but I want to finish my point with the records, and I'll come back to Chong the Nomad. And the other side is this artist, Stas the Boss. And so I put the split record together with them. So Chong the Nomad was on the A side, and Stas the Boss was on the B side of the album. So it was two completely separate projects that we just stuck together as a split LP. And that was also one where we opted to do this random color option. So you pull those out, and sometimes when people post them on social media, it's really interesting because I've never seen a lot of the colors because, to your point, I sold a shrink wrapped record to someone, and it's much later that someone pulls it out of their sleeve and posts a photo online of this bright orange record, or that it's
Right.
purple with green stripes on it, or whatever it is. I actually had a friend who was really excited about that album. He was like, "Oh, great, I want to buy one of these." And so I sold him a copy of it, and he immediately pulled it out of the shrink wrap, and his album was black. But it's random, they were all random. So I was like,
Oh,
"Sorry, I can give you a different one." I'm just, uh,
oh my gosh.
um,
Oh,
but yeah, so that's also a really interesting part of the process. I wanted to mention Chong the Nomad though, and I don't want to forget at this point, is
yeah.
that Chong the Nomad is this amazing musician, beat maker. She went to Cornish, and I crossed paths with her in 2018. She had put out a short EP online, which is the one that I had put out on vinyl. And when I heard this EP, it just blew me away. And she was starting to play shows. She had, I think, played like Capitol Hill Block Party, and she was scheduled to play Bumbershoot. And so, these are artists who are on the scene. They're playing big shows. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but Chong the Nomad is an artist who when she was starting her musical career, she was working at a ramen shop, and she one day was listening to the sounds of the ramen shop and the sounds of people slurping soup and the sounds of people banging the sides of pots and pans, and she took a field microphone and recorded all these sounds in and around the ramen shop, and then made an electronic music track that is just wild from all the sounds from the ramen shop. And
Okay.
she has since, gone on to do any number of songs. But one of the things she did, she was worked with Singapore Airlines, and they had her play, quote unquote, a 747 airplane, and she went around the airplane and she was playing with the tray tables and the buttons and the sensors and the masks falling down and the cutlery on the
Oh,
plane and
wow.
the sound of the wheels, and again made a whole ad campaign for Singapore Airlines based on the sounds of a Singapore Airlines 747. So really, really wild, creative, different stuff. And she actually, this is again, I feel like I have this opportunity to work with artists at an early stage in their career. When I worked with Chong the Nomad, it was 2018, and she had only released 6 songs online and was still figuring out her
Right.
career and had just graduated from Cornish. Um, Earlier this year, or last year, I guess it was, she was one of the co-writers of the theme music for the new Marvel Shang-Chi movie, Shang-Chi and the Ten
Okay.
Rings. So she was one of the co-writers of the theme music for that movie. And so she's sort of really gone a huge way in her stature and her career over the last 4 years.
And that's all because you launched a record.
No, I mean, it's because of a lot of things.
Just,
I mean, I'm happy.
No, I'm being
But
facetious.
I'm happy
yeah.
to be
She's-
involved with artists at the early stage and help them out with the early stage in their career. And that's an important thing for me, is that I try to work with artists who are, are achieving a certain level of success here in Seattle and in the Northwest, but who
Mhm.
I think there's a challenge for a lot of artists to make working in music in the Northwest a career. Seattle is an incredibly expensive city. I think there's a challenge to get enough attention in Seattle from the local community. You can be Chong the Nomad and you can be playing Capitol Hill Block Party. Are you garnering enough fans in the Seattle area to pay your bills? And
Right.
so I think that's one of the things that I try to work with artists to make vinyl records, so that we can then take those vinyl records and sell them in record stores all across the country and all around the world. And can we get that record into a record store in LA? Can we sell it at Amoeba Records? Can we sell it at Rough Trade in New York City? Can we sell it at Shuga Records in Chicago? Can we sell it at Manhattan Records in Tokyo? And that's really part of where I'm also trying to do with these albums, is to really help these artists grow their fan base and their stature beyond the Northwest. And vinyl allows us to do that.
So the capitalist in me doesn't look like there's a lot of money in this, which is completely fine. But how does a small boutique label, is this a hobby for you? Is this a passion project?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so as such, what does the future, what do you want the future of this to look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like I started out this label with an idea that I wanted to take a couple or three, let's see, I've been doing this now for 5 years. I've released 13 albums. So that's an average of 2 to 3 a year. And and as a hobby, as you put it, I
Hmm.
would say I don't have much more capacity to do more than that many albums because I'm very hands-on with the process. Like
Hmm.
I'm hands-on from the early stages of working with the artist to figure out whether or not we're even doing the album, all the way through
Hmm.
to the manufacturing process, which can be quite elaborate, all the way through to that's the thing about vinyl is that the process probably takes 6 months to a year to make an album. And and when I say that, it's because at the start, you start with, okay, what is the project? What are we making? What songs are on this record? What does the cover art look like? Who is writing the liner notes? How are we getting the audio mastered or how are we getting the audio optimized for the vinyl format? Who's going to do the manufacturing? How are we getting everything kind of all the ducks lined up for this process? You then go into manufacturing, which maybe takes about 6 months, and the pandemic has again been really messy in this regard. Like some pressing plants are quoting me 18-month delays between when they commit to a project and when you'll actually get your records. And it's tough, like in this world, to say, okay, great, I am really excited about this album that's going to come out in 2024. It's that's
Yeah,
it's a amount of time that becomes prohibitive, and I think that's a big challenge as I look to the future is as our supply chains are being challenged over the past couple of years. It is tough for me to sustain um, enthusiasm and interest in a project when, especially for me and for the artist, if the time horizon is so far out. Um,
well, and the artist is by the nature of being creative, they're not gonna. Oh, I would hope they're not gonna stop being creative for the next 12
Absolutely.
months. Why this project's yeah, so they're moving on to something else, and so when you finally get the physical product, going back to Picasso, now he's in his blue period, so this isn't a representative of his
No,
current work.
exactly. And I think that's a challenge. So, I mean, but the process probably takes about 6 months right now. And I'm working with some partners. Part of this move towards starting to crowdsource albums where we do more upfront in terms of bringing money in, but also securing some of those partners earlier on in the process will allow us to shorten some of the production timeline. Um, but
Hmm.
yeah, the production turnaround is a challenge. That's one of the things for sure. But I would say that you know uh, I like doing 2 or 3 albums a year. I think that's sustainable, and I think
Hmm.
that I could see doing another couple albums next year and doing a couple albums after that. It's something that I looked at this at one point and said, okay, what does success look like? Do I want to be scaling to a point where I'm putting out 30 albums a year? Do I want to be, and does that help the music and the scene? Um,
Hmm.
or do you end up in a situation of just oversaturating? Is this the caliber drop of the quality of any individual album drop when you're putting out 30 of them? Are you able to spend the
Hmm.
amount of time and attention on an album that you would otherwise like to? And so for me, like I don't know that I really want to scale up to like more albums. Um, so in that regard, I don't know. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, what I've seen as well though is that in the last couple of years, a lot has changed. And that's the one thing I would say right now for me that has been most top of mind is um, trying to, I think from the outside, there's this sense of like the label and what we're doing here is very outwardly successful. I think inwardly, there's a real we've been under a state of a lot of pressure over the last 2 years. I'll explain what I mean. Like, 2 years ago or so, suddenly the live music scene just vanished, and we were all suddenly stuck inside for a chunk of time. And we had to wear masks, and we should get vaccinated, and we should get boosted. And now there's this real pressure to emerge from the pandemic, and it's over, and get moving, and this real sense that over the last 2 years, I personally have felt very like bullied by society. And and what I mean is just that, like, I had other plans for 2020. I had other things I was planning to do, and that sense of choice was sort of taken from us, to kind of do what we wanted. And at the end of 2020, I made a movie. So let me step back here. In 2019, I was really interested in wanting to make a movie about the local hip hop scene. And
Mm-hmm.
because I had been going to shows for many years and shooting little Instagram clips, I had an opportunity. There was a Seattle Hip Hop Film Festival, which, to be clear, wasn't a film festival of Seattle movies. It was a hip
Mm-hmm.
hop film festival that happened to be based in Seattle, and they were going to be showing hip hop movies from Mexico and from France and from New York and from other parts of the country. And I knew the people
Right.
who were involved in it, who were organizing this event, and they had said to me, "Hey, you've got all these Instagram clips. Maybe you could do a highlight reel or something of the best of the year of Instagram clips." And so I started putting together this movie, and realized when I went through my computer, I had hours and hours and hours of time of just little moments of artists performing, on stages all throughout the Northwest. Artists performing on stages in Tacoma, artists performing in back alleys in Seattle, playing on large stages, whether it's the Showbox or Numos, or some of these larger venues in and around the Seattle
Mm-hmm.
area, the Crocodile. And so I started working on this movie, and my intention had been to make this film that would be a celebration of, artists performing on stages all throughout the Northwest. And when I was working on this movie, I uh, when I was getting ready to release the movie, I had booked three movie theaters, one in Tacoma and two in Seattle, to screen this movie called Newcomer, a Seattle hip hop movie. And was
Mm-hmm.
I released some trailers, and the movie was going to air in three movie theaters the last week of March 2020. And
Okay.
and of course, the pandemic was declared on the 14th of March, and so I had to scrap these three movie screenings, and I put the movie aside for a number of months, because I found when I pulled out this film that was nothing but an hour and a half of concert footage of people in crowds jumping up and down and seeing amazing performances and amazing performers. uh, April 2020 was the time when it felt like that was the furthest from ever being a reality again. And I found the movie really hard to
Mm-hmm.
watch for a while. But my plan for 2020 had been to actually take this movie and be a kind of a touring show, and take it to Denver, and take it to LA, and and screen this movie all about the Northwest hip hop scene, in all of these
Mm-hmm.
markets all across the US, and kind of show off, how great we have it here. And so for me, like, that was my plan for 2020, and that was completely derailed by the fact that we all shut our doors and stayed inside for a year. Um, and Yeah, so I think right now, like, as we look to the future, I think, I feel this pressure from society to, like, get on with it. Like, the pandemic's over, we got to get back to stuff. And I've actually been taking this time right now to do the opposite. I think it's a good time to stop and listen, and pay attention, and see how, because a lot's changed. The mood is very different now. Even the artists that I've worked with for the past 5 years, some of them moved to LA. Some of them are haven't released any music since before the pandemic. So I think it's a good time to kind of sit back for a moment and sort of reassess what the state of affairs is. Some of the artists, as I said, that were kind of big on the scene 2 or 3 years ago don't live here anymore.
Hmm.
And how has that changed the feeling and the nature of the scene? Who I went to a showcase a couple weeks ago that was a bunch of new artists. It was a lot of young rappers and musicians, many of whom were 20, 21 years old. And these are young people
Hmm.
who, for the last 2 or 3 years, they're going through the end of their teen years, and this is the only way they've ever known the world to be. And and the music and the hip hop and the rap that they're making. And this was a whole lineup. It was like 20 people on a like an open mic kind of format. I don't think I knew a single name of anyone who was performing at this event, because this is a
Hmm.
whole new generation of people who have kind of come up through the cracks of the pandemic and are about to kind of make waves in the scene. And and so that's the thing I would say is that a lot has changed in the last couple of years, because it's been 2 years of being in a kind of fog in some ways, and the landscape is quite different. And so I'm trying to pay attention to that.
Okay. So one of the questions I ask musicians when they're on the show, and we'll treat you like a
Sure.
musician for this question, where, well, I'll ask you, I can only ask you one half the question. And the question is, where's some great venues to see music in in your region, in Seattle, wherever you can go, Everett, Tacoma, I don't care. Washington State's my only
Sure.
criteria. So like you mentioned Numos, you mentioned Chop Suey earlier, you mentioned Showbox, you said Tacoma, but you didn't drop a name of a
Oh,
venue in
sure.
Tacoma. So where's some good venues in your
Yeah,
opinion?
there's a whole bunch of great places, and I don't know that any of the places I mentioned were some of my favorites. I think one of my favorite places to see live hip hop music that is a real kind of spiritual center for hip hop, especially in Seattle proper, is Vermilion Art Gallery and Bar. That's on 11th between Pike and Pine, so it's right in the heart of Capitol Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And Vermilion is really a place where you're gonna see like really like the real raw hip hop from artists who are just they're gonna make hip hop whether or not they're making a dime off of it. And it's a really
Mm-hmm.
great kind of venue for just seeing up and comers, new talent. Um, Somewhere else I really like is underneath Numos. There's a venue called Barboza, which is the kind of the basement
Mm-hmm.
version of Numos. And Barboza is often a great place that you'll see really cool local artists performing. Um, in Tacoma, there's Alma Mater is a complex that has a restaurant on one floor. They often play a lot of hip hop shows on the rooftop of Alma Mater. That's been a place I've seen a number of artists perform, which has been great. There's a a streetwear shop in Tacoma called ETC Tacoma. It's run by a bunch of young guys who are really hip and make really cool, fashionable designer clothes. And they,
Okay.
it's a lot of streetwear, but it's like really cool streetwear, kind of like Supreme or something. And a lot of hip hop artists in Tacoma and Seattle wear a lot of ETC Tacoma clothing when they're performing on stage.
Okay.
And ETC Tacoma, the reason I bring this up, often does open mics and events at their shop, which are not to be missed. That's a really
Okay.
great place to go as a hub for kind of what's happening in the Northwest in that area. The last thing I was going to say when I mentioned Vermilion is that every second Saturday this year, Vermilion has been one of the people behind an event called On the Block. So every second Saturday,
Mhm.
so it's the second Saturday of the month. So it would be I guess the 12th of wait, what's the weekend? Yeah, with a I don't have a calendar in front of me, but there's the 10th or
Yeah.
11th of September would be the next one
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
that, and that again takes place on in front of their art gallery on 11th between Pike and Pine. They close that whole street for that block They set up a stage on the street. They sometimes have two stages on the street, and all
Wow.
day there are hip hop artists playing on the street. There's vendors, clothing. There's artwork you can buy, and that's been a really phenomenal street party that's been happening all summer in this year 2022. It's free, and so that's a great place to see artists performing. And one of the other people behind that is All Star Vintage. That's a shop that's in Tacoma, and they're connected to Northwest Throwbacks, which is another vintage sports show shop here in Seattle. And they also run a label called Pick Six Cassettes, and some cool Seattle hip hop artists have come out of cassettes on Pick Six Cassettes, which they sell at both Northwest Throwbacks and at All Star Vintage in Tacoma. So
Right.
those are definitely some things to check out.
Okay. You mentioned Vermilion, and I knew that name sounded familiar to me. I had a guest on several months ago, and the Seattle Jazz Fellowship has their jazz summer series at Vermilion on
Oh yeah,
Wednesdays.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's I knew I'd heard that name before. So, all right. Well, let me ask you this: when you're not doing wearing all of the hats of records, what do you and your wife like to do for fun and entertainment?
It's funny. We really got into hiking during the pandemic. I don't know. One of the things that I found was that I made a lot of changes to my habits in the last couple of years. I stopped drinking. That was one of the things that changed for me in the last 2 years. Um,
Uh huh.
and But my wife and we live in our apartment and we don't have any outdoor space, and so we just found, as 2020 started to go on and we were inside all the time, that we just really needed to get out. And so we downloaded the Washington Trails Association has an app that you can download for your phone, and you can dial in
Yep.
like the length of hike you want and how much of elevation, and then it'll spit out a bunch of results of hikes that you can do that meet your criteria, that aren't too vertical and maybe aren't too long and aren't too far away.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started using the WTA app, and every week for the last couple of years, we have a weekly ritual where we go for a hike. So we've driven all across Washington State, and this is the one thing, like, we're not from here. So when we first moved to Seattle, we always sort of would think to ourselves, like, someday I want to be one of those people who, like, gets my hiking poles and goes for a big hike in the wilderness. And it was really during the pandemic that Jen and I were both staring out at the mountains every day, thinking, why aren't we those people who go hiking in the mountains every week? So we really made a commitment to becoming Northwesterners and getting to know all these hiking trails in and around the area. That's been a big hobby for us.
All right. That you set me up for my
Sure.
next question. If you're truly embracing the Seattle, Washington lifestyle, you got to share your favorite coffee shop
Sure.
with me.
Yeah. It's funny, you referred to this podcast to me when we were chatting as like having a good coffee with someone. And so I have this really great coffee shop called Analog Coffee, which is only a couple blocks from my
Mhm.
apartment. And I went there just before this podcast and bought a coffee from Analog, and I've been drinking it this whole time we've been talking. But
Okay.
Analog, for me, is actually important. Analog also has a role in starting the record label, because when I first moved to Seattle, I've been living in the same apartment since when I moved here, and I started
Mm-hmm.
going to this coffee shop, Analog, and it was a fairly new coffee shop. It's now been around for 10 years, but when it first opened, it was started by two guys, Danny and Tim, who both worked in the coffee industry, and they would, of a Saturday afternoon, be sitting around in their apartment, because they were roommates, and they would sit around in their apartment drinking coffee and making coffee drinks for each other and listening to records. And they had this brilliant moment of saying, we could just be doing this as a job, and we could just open. So they opened a pop up coffee shop where they would just play vinyl records all day and make coffee. And that has now become Analog Coffee. And so that the name Analog comes from the fact that they play records at their coffee shop all day. And they are someone that I always, whenever I have a new record, they're the first place I take the first pressing to, and they get the exclusive of playing this album for the public. So that's been
Oh.
something that has been kind of a ritual. So sometimes what'll happen, especially if I have an album, when you make a record, you'll get what's called a test pressing, which is they press a few to make sure that there's no
Hmm.
errors, and then if those few pass muster, then they'll press the rest of the run. And so I often will bring the test pressing to analog, and they'll have it for a short period of time before it's even available for the rest of the public. And a certain amount of their clientele will be like, "What's this music playing? Like, who is this band? Like, please tell me about this artist." And again, it's just a way to like get the word out about music that is being made in the Northwest by amazing, hip hop artists, and that you can go buy on vinyl at your local record store. Um,
Have you ever? I'm sure you have. I'm going to guess you have. Have you ever watched the movie High
sure.
Fidelity? Okay, so High Fidelity. The movie was great. The book
Yeah.
was amazing. The spin-off TV series wasn't
Yeah.
as great, but it was still okay. But I remember this scene, the way you just described this. I just remember the scene in the movie where he goes, "You want to watch me sell some records?" And he puts on
Yeah.
the
That's
beta
it.
band, and all of a sudden everybody's heads are nodding
Absolutely.
in the record store. They go,
Yeah.
"Who's this?" And then, it started. That's kind of what I just had this real
And
mental
ultimately
splash.
that's something of the vision for the record label, is records appear in people's lives in unexpected places. And so the number of times, it's funny to say this, but the number of times that I will randomly walk into, I mean, I go to Analog Coffee like 7 or 10 times a week because it's near me, so
Okay.
I'm often like, oh, I'll go get a coffee at Analog. But the number of times that I have walked into Analog and they have been playing one of the albums that I've released has been remarkable. Like, it's just coincidental. They're not putting it on. They're not checking to see if I'm showing.
Oh, Gary's coming in. Let's
Exactly.
put
But
it
the number
on.
of times
Yeah.
that I'll walk
Okay.
in and I'll see one of the albums they've been playing them, and that's part of it, is to create new ways for someone to engage with music that's being made here in the Northwest. And that's ultimately the goal of what I'm trying to do, is encourage more people in the Northwest to listen to music being made by artists who live here and who are making music about
Mm-hmm.
our community. Some of these albums, are, I put up this record last year with AJ Suede. So AJ Suede's the artist I just put this 13th album out with, but I actually did a split
Mm-hmm.
vinyl with AJ Suede and another artist, Specs Wizard, in 2020. And both AJ Suede and Specs Wizard were really influenced by the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter,
Mm-hmm.
all of the protests that were happening, and the Chaz chop that was going on in Capitol Hill, and all of the controversy that was happening in the summer of 2020. Both of these rappers and musicians were really influenced by everything that was going on and made music about that time. And so that was one of the albums I released, was an album that really tried to encapsulate the summer of 2020. And I worked with a young Black graphic designer named Damascus Purnell, and I commissioned him to design a cover for this. And he had gone to a number of the protests and had taken a whole bunch of photographs of people at the protests at Capitol Hill and all the graffiti on the walls, and he created a collage cover artwork that incorporates all of this visual imagery, as well as these two rappers talking about this existence of being stuck at home and watching too much YouTube, and how we're sort of influenced by what's happening in the media. Similarly, that same year, I put out a record called On the Corner, with a Q, on the Quarner. That was by Stas
Mm-hmm.
the Boss. She was really influenced by a Miles Davis record called On the Corner, um, and
Mm.
and heavily sampled this Miles Davis record, but made a record about quarantine and staying at home and washing your hands, and so On the Corner by Stas the Boss with a Q is all about the early days of the pandemic. And so again,
Okay.
this is just music that's trying to respond to the times that we live in and talk about what it's like to live in the Northwest and go through recent history.
We could keep going on, but well, if you've listened this far, folks, we broke this into 2 episodes. I'm going to split this into 2 episodes. Not sure where we're going to cut it in half, but we're going to split this one. But what didn't I ask you that I should have asked you?
I don't know. I know we did a lot of talking. Let's see. I wrote some notes just in case there was anything I wanted to talk about, but I honestly, we sort of hit upon everything that I wrote down here. So, I did look up a place to eat.
Oh, yes.
Um,
But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about food. So what do you got
it's
for me?
funny. I was back in Toronto in the a few weeks ago, I mentioned, and some friends really wanted to take me to a Northwest themed bar in Toronto, and which was funny because I really hadn't thought of like this identity of the sort of Northwest dive bar, and
neither have I.
But there's a whole bunch of places here in Seattle. There's a bar called Revolver that is on Summit. There's a Loretta's Northwesterner, which is down in South Park. That's has the best hamburger in the country, one of the best hamburgers in the country. And both of those are really distinctive. Linda's is another great bar here in Capitol Hill that's on Pine Street. And you think about what do those bars have in common? It's a lot of wood. So there's like neon signs. There's probably at least in the case of Linda's, there's a Laura Palmer like framed photo behind the counter from Twin Peaks. When I went to this Northwest themed bar in Canada, they had like Nirvana posters and Jimi Hendrix stuff on the walls, and so I really like going to Northwest dive bars. I mean, that's one of my favorite kind of places here. And as I said, I don't know that I ever thought of them as being a unique to the Pacific Northwest thing until somebody took me to a Northwest themed bar in a totally different city where they don't have these kinds of bars. So that was,
I've never thought
that was fun.
Okay. All right.
All
right. That's cool.
Yeah.
All right.
There's all these amazing local artists who are making great music, and I really encourage you to go check them out. It's whether or not you're a fan of hip hop. I didn't come into this as a fan of hip hop. I just came into this as a fan of cool music that surprised me and got my attention. And I am trying to put up music that will be something worth your time and worth listening to, and worth spending the ritual of taking it out of the sleeve and reading the liner notes and putting it on your turntable and having a good sit with an album. And that's really why I started doing this and what I'm trying to do.
I think that's an amazingly good cause. I think we're all too easily distracted and too easily connected, and yet we're all alone. Our phones are amazingly good and bad. The phone can keep you in touch with everybody, but at the same time, it also is a very relentless taskmaster if you have your notifications turned on. How many times does your phone bing and bong and tweet at you and all of this stuff? So the idea of sitting down with, in my case, good cup of coffee, turntable, record, sit in my comfortable chair and actually take in side one with whatever album. And then probably because I'll need another cup of coffee, go make the coffee, turn it over side two and do the same thing, is a ritual of great enjoyment versus listening to that same album as I'm driving between point A and point B. It's a completely different experience to truly take in an album, especially if it's an album that the artist has thought about the flow of the album from track to track to track.
Yeah, that's been that's one of the big things. There's an album I put out with Gifted Gab. She's an amazingly talented rapper and singer here from the Northwest. Her album that I released with her is called Cause and Effect. She painted the cover art for Cause and Effect. And the vinyl itself, the A side, is all hard hitting kind of murder raps. There's really like
Okay.
intense, like aggressive rap music. And the B side is
Okay.
all R&B torch songs. And so that was one
Oh,
again where the idea of the vinyl was really considered when we wanted to put the album together, is that you were going to get kind of two sides of Gifted Gab on this album, and that the A side had one vision and mood, and the B side had a very different mood, and the album reflects that. So
okay. All right. So I'm going to end this conversation with the final question. It's a new one. We're trying it out. Simple question. I want you to hear all of it before you make your response.
sure.
Right? Cake or pie, and why?
That's a tough one. I guess cake. I I made a cake for the first time ever at some point during the pandemic. I had never really thought about just making a cake. When we were at home so much and we were making so many of our own meals, at some point I just got a craving for cake, and I thought I'm just going to learn how to make a cake. And so I did, and I made this great cake, and I just had it sitting under a cake tray, and of an evening I would just have a piece of cake for whatever the week that I had a cake there, and it was wonderful. And so yeah, it's cake for me, I guess.
Okay. All right. Well, Gary, thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun for
Sure.
me. I applaud what you're doing. And I know we've left out a lot of things, and we're going to put some links to where people can find your website and in Crane City Music and all that. So people can go investigate more, and I encourage them to. But thank you for making this happen.
Thank you very much for having me.
Join us next time for another episode of the Exploring Washington State podcast.